How has index fund ownership affected price informativeness?
So yeah, again, index fund ownership, I think is good. Let's be precise about, I have a paper on this, but I'm looking narrowly at things that are defined as index funds. And we have to also be really careful about what I mean by price informativeness. And so in that paper, I am zooming in on the incorporation of earnings information ahead of earnings announcements. So just to be clear, I'm defining the rules of the game over a very narrow time window before a very clear release of information.
Mm.
Now, before we get into the answer, I think it's important to highlight some of the trade-offs, like the economic mechanisms that actually might be in play. So I think people think, look, well, if we think back to our Grossman-Stiglitz style framework, and we have a bunch of people who are, essentially saying, I'm going to index my money. I'm going to put it in Vanguard, right? They're not driving the car around Massachusetts. And so as fewer and fewer people drive the car around Massachusetts, maybe ahead of earnings announcements, less and less of that information gets incorporated ahead of time, right? And therefore, about that earnings information, prices maybe are a little bit less informative, right? That's one part of the story. But, there's other parts of the story. So for example, suppose you're an active manager. Suppose you want to take a bet on Facebook. Now you have ETFs that make it easier to hedge, right? So you can go long Facebook, short some tech sector ETF rather than having to go out and short a bunch of individual stocks. It might help you isolate that bet.
Mm.
Or, a lot of passive, funds lend out their shares. They're allowed to lend out a certain fraction. And so suppose some bad news is coming. Well, if we've increased the lendable supply of shares or we've decreased the relative cost of shorting, maybe now bad news can get into prices more efficiently because we're allowed to, we can short easier ahead of bad news. And so I think like if we just think the Grossman-Stiglitz, it's like really simple, but I want to highlight that like there's a lot of different forces.
Mm.
One other thing to think about is that there's different types of information, right? There's systematic information and there's idiosyncratic information. And so if you think about the RV dealership, maybe we have some information about that one RV company, but it also could be if like consumer sentiment is low and people aren't buying RVs, that's systematic information.
Mm.
And maybe having an RV ETF like lets you bet on the systematic information in the easier way. And so like
Mm.
we have to be really,
Mm.
really precise that I'm talking about firm specific information ahead of earnings announcements, and I find that it does decrease the earnings information and prices ahead of time. But again, there's work that has shown everything else, increasing systematic information, increasing long run information. So I'm really making a narrow claim about less earnings information being incorporated into prices ahead of time.
Hmm. So that's when earnings are released, prices contained less information about those earnings at that time. Yeah. Okay.
That's the very narrow point that I am zoomed in on in that paper.
Hmm. I remember we talked to Ralph Cohen a while ago on this podcast, and he talked about findings in one of his papers suggesting that the shift to passive has not affected price informative. Do you know why your findings are different?
Well, I think it goes back to the point you raised before is that so first of all, I guess the thing that I like about looking at earnings announcements is that, I'm working on a new project on this. And so hopefully, you'll have me back or we'll talk about it another time that like there may be suppose you have a 1 cent earnings beat versus a 2 cents earning beat. Like we don't know maybe how much more prices should move for the 2 cent earning beat than 1 cent earning beat, but we know that that's good news.
Mm.
Similarly, if you don't beat earnings, we know that it's bad news. And so like we could think about like a response function to earning surprises, like that's pretty clear kind of what we should do with good news buy, bad news sell. And so I actually don't even have a theoretical model in the paper. I'm really just looking at this idea of like, well, if the news was going to be good,
Mm.
prices should have went up ahead of time. Like my thing is very simple, going back to the 60s, like Ball and Brown, like classic finance stuff.
Hmm.
They have a model and they're also using one of these measures where they're regressing long
Mm-hmm.
run future earnings on prices today. And we've said before that even really smart people can disagree what the right hand side and left hand side of
Right.
that regression should be. And so when you're measuring, also they're measuring it over a much longer horizon than I have. That original paper looked up to 5 years
Hmm.
afterward. I'm looking at a span of 22 days. And so it could go back to what we said before. It could be that passive has a short effect, and it could be once that news comes out, because it's easier to short stocks, because it's easier to incorporate systematic information. For all the other reasons, once the news comes out, people could trade it into prices faster. And so the effect is really not a long run effect, but a short run effect.
Hmm.